Hey friends, tonight we are chiseling away at the layers of history to uncover the story of a single, unassuming slab of stone that became the key to unlocking an entire ancient civilization. Imagine finding an old instruction manual, but it's written in three different scripts, one of which has been a complete mystery for over 1,000 years. That's the kind of linguistic puzzle we're exploring with the Rosetta Stone. You're probably thinking, cool, a linguistic decoder ring. And it was, eventually. But let's be honest, if you were tasked with meticulously carving a lengthy royal decree into unyielding granodiorite with ancient tools, or trying to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs without Google Translate, or even a basic understanding of ancient Egyptian culture, you probably wouldn't survive the sheer tedium, the blisters, or the centuries of baffled silence. It makes assembling flat-pack furniture feel like a walk in the park. So before you get too comfortable, go ahead and take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're all tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below. Now, turn off your lights, turn on your fan for some gentle white noise, and let's begin tonight's journey. You find yourself transported back to ancient Egypt, specifically to the year 196 BCE. The air is warm and dry, carrying the scent of the Nile, fertile earth, and perhaps the distant aroma of incense from a nearby temple. Egypt is under the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Greek kings who had inherited the land of the pharaohs after Alexander the Great's conquests. The reigning monarch is a young pharaoh, Ptolemy V Epiphanes, who ascended to the throne as a child and has recently come of age. His reign has been marked by unrest and revolt in parts of the country, and the priests, a powerful and influential class, are key to maintaining stability and legitimizing his rule. It's against this backdrop of political maneuvering and religious authority that our stone begins its story, not as a linguistic key, but as a piece of public relations, an ancient press release carved in stone. The Rosetta Stone, as we now call it, is actually a fragment of a larger stele, or commemorative slab, bearing a decree issued by a council of Egyptian priests assembled at Memphis. This decree, known as the Memphis Decree, wasn't a particularly earth-shattering piece of news in itself at the time. Its main purpose was to affirm the royal cult of the 13-year-old Ptolemy V on the first anniversary of his coronation. You can imagine the scene. Priests from temples all across Egypt gathered, perhaps in a grand temple precinct, discussing the honors to be bestowed upon their young king. The decree lists a series of benefactions granted by Ptolemy V to the priesthood, including tax exemptions, always a popular move with any group, donations of silver and grain to the temples, and the release of certain prisoners. In return, the priests pledge their loyalty and agree to establish statues of Ptolemy V in every temple to celebrate his birthday and coronation day with special festivals and, crucially for our story, to have the decree inscribed on stelae of hard stone. A mainstream historical fact is that this practice of issuing decrees in multiple scripts to ensure widespread understanding and to assert royal authority was common in Ptolemaic Egypt, a multicultural society with Greek rulers and an Egyptian populace. The decree itself stipulates that it should be inscribed in three scripts: hieroglyphic, Demotic, and ancient Greek. This trilingual format is the reason the Rosetta Stone would eventually become so famous. The hieroglyphic script, those beautiful pictorial characters you associate with ancient Egypt, was the sacred script used for religious texts and monumental inscriptions, understood mainly by priests and highly educated scribes. Demotic was the everyday script used by the general Egyptian populace for business and legal documents, a more cursive, abbreviated form derived from hieratic, which itself was a cursive form of hieroglyphs. And ancient Greek was the language of the administration, the court, and the Ptolemaic rulers themselves. You can almost see the practical reasoning: hieroglyphs for the gods, and the priestly tradition, Demotic for the native Egyptian officials and literate public, and Greek for the ruling class and the wider Hellenistic world. It was an attempt to communicate the king's benevolence and the priest's loyalty to all key segments of society. Now imagine the actual carving of this decree. The stone itself is granodiorite, a hard, dark, igneous rock similar to granite, chosen for its durability. This wasn't a quick job. You can picture skilled stonemasons, their muscles aching, painstakingly chiseling each character into the unyielding surface. The hieroglyphs, with their intricate details, would have required immense precision. The Demotic, with its flowing lines, and the Greek, with its familiar alphabet, each presented their own challenges. One quirky detail is that the quality of the carving on the Rosetta Stone isn't considered top tier for Egyptian monumental inscriptions. There are some inconsistencies and less than perfect characters, suggesting perhaps a degree of haste, or that it was one of many copies made for distribution. Historians still debate exactly where the Rosetta Stone was originally displayed. The decree states that copies were to be set up in every temple of the first, second, and third rank, so it was likely intended for a temple, perhaps in or near the town of Sais in the Nile Delta, given some textual clues. For now, though, it stands as a testament to a young king's efforts to secure his kingdom. Its three scripts, a silent witness to a multicultural society, unaware of the linguistic treasure it would one day become. For a time, you can imagine the stele of which the Rosetta Stone was a part standing proudly in its designated temple courtyard, perhaps alongside other similar decrees, fulfilling its purpose as a public affirmation of Ptolemy V's piety and the priest's loyalty. The three scripts, hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek, would have been legible to different segments of the population, a testament to the multicultural world of Ptolemaic Egypt. Priests would have understood the sacred hieroglyphs, local officials and scribes the Demotic, and Greek administrators and settlers the Greek. It was a functional document, a piece of political and religious communication meant to be seen and understood, reinforcing the bonds between the ruler, the priesthood, and the people. But as centuries pass, the world around this stone, and countless others like it, begins to change dramatically. The Ptolemaic dynasty eventually gives way to Roman rule in 30 BCE. While the Romans initially respected and even adopted some aspects of Egyptian religion, the old traditions gradually began to wane. The knowledge of how to read and write the intricate hieroglyphic script, once the domain of a highly educated priestly and scribal class, started to fade. You can picture the temple schools where this ancient knowledge was passed down becoming fewer, the number of scribes proficient in the sacred pictograms dwindling. The rise of Christianity as the dominant religion of the Roman Empire from the 4th century CEE onwards dealt a final decisive blow to the ancient Egyptian religious system. Temples were closed, their endowments confiscated, and the old gods were increasingly seen as relics of a pagan past. A mainstream historical fact is that the last known hieroglyphic inscription dates to 394 CE, found at the Temple of Philae. After that, the knowledge of how to read these beautiful, enigmatic symbols effectively died out for over 1,400 years, plunging millennia of Egyptian history into silence. With the temples abandoned or repurposed, and the ancient scripts no longer understood, stele like the one bearing the Memphis Decree lost their original meaning and function. They became just large, heavy pieces of carved stone. You can imagine them toppling over due to neglect or earthquakes, or being deliberately pulled down. Their hard, durable granodiorite, once chosen for its ability to preserve inscriptions for eternity, now made them attractive as ready-quarried building material. It's a common fate for ancient monuments in many cultures. When their original purpose is forgotten, they are recycled. One quirky detail is that many ancient Egyptian temples and tombs were systematically dismantled over the centuries, their beautifully carved stones reused in later buildings, fortifications, or even burned for lime. It's a sobering thought that for every magnificent artifact that survives, countless others were lost in this way. The Rosetta Stone itself, or rather the larger stele it was part of, eventually suffered this fate. At some point, likely centuries after its creation, it was broken up, and our particular fragment was transported from its original temple location to the port city of Rosetta, known in Arabic as Rashid, on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, near the mouth of the Nile. There, it was incorporated as just another chunk of stone into the foundations or walls of a defensive structure. Historians still debate exactly when and how this happened. Was it during the Mamluk period, when fortifications were being strengthened, or perhaps earlier? The precise details of its journey from sacred decree to humble building block are lost to time. You can almost feel the irony. A stone designed to proclaim a king's glory for eternity, now buried anonymously within the ramparts of a fort, its precious trilingual inscription facing inwards, unseen and unread, its potential as a key to a lost civilization completely unrecognized. For hundreds of years it lay there, a silent prisoner of war, so to speak, waiting for a chance rediscovery that would eventually unlock the voices of ancient Egypt. The slow chisels that carved it had long since fallen silent, and now only the slow passage of time and the shifting sands of history held its fate. The centuries of silence for our stone, embedded anonymously in some forgotten fortification, are about to come to an abrupt and history-altering end. You find yourself whisked forward in time to the summer of 1799. Egypt is once again a land in turmoil, this time caught in the crosscurrents of European ambition. Napoleon Bonaparte, then a young and audacious general of the French Republic, has invaded Egypt. His aims are multifaceted: to disrupt British trade routes to India, to establish a French presence in the Middle East, and perhaps to bask in the glory of conquering a land so steeped in ancient history. Accompanying his army is a large contingent of scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers, the savants, tasked with studying and documenting every aspect of Egypt's past and present. It's a military campaign, but also a vast scientific expedition. Your focus narrows to the port town of Rosetta, or Rashid, on the western branch of the Nile Delta. French soldiers are busy working under the hot July sun, strengthening the defenses of an old Mamluk fort, which they've dubbed Fort Julian, to protect themselves from British and Ottoman forces. You can imagine the scene: the dust, the sweat, the shouted commands in French, the clatter of tools as they dismantle old walls and build new ones. It's hard, pragmatic military work, not a treasure hunt. Lieutenant Pierre-François Bouchard, an officer in Napoleon's engineering corps, is overseeing some of these demolition and construction efforts. He's a young man, likely more concerned with the structural integrity of the fort than with ancient inscriptions. But then, on or around July 15th, 1799, during the demolition of an old wall within the fort, something remarkable happens. A soldier, or perhaps Bouchard himself, notices a particular slab of dark stone that has been incorporated into the structure. It's not just any stone. One side is covered in carved inscriptions. And not just one type of inscription, but three distinct bands of writing. You can picture Bouchard, perhaps wiping away centuries of dust and grime, his curiosity piqued. The top section is clearly pictorial, those enigmatic hieroglyphs. The middle section is a flowing cursive script, later identified as Demotic. And the bottom section is, unmistakably, Ancient Greek, a language that many educated Europeans of the time could read. A mainstream historical fact is Bouchard's immediate recognition that this trilingual inscription could be incredibly significant. If the three scripts all recorded the same text, then the Greek, which was understandable, could provide a key to deciphering the mysterious Egyptian scripts that had baffled scholars for centuries. The excitement must have been palpable, even amidst the ongoing military campaign. Here, in the dusty rubble of an old fort, was a potential pathway back into the lost world of ancient Egyptian thought and history. Bouchard ensures the stone is preserved. Word quickly spreads among the French savants accompanying the expedition. One quirky detail is that the stone was almost immediately recognized as being so important that it was moved to Cairo and housed at the Institut d'Egypte, the scientific institution Napoleon had founded. Even amidst the chaos of war and occupation, the scholarly value of this chance find was understood. Historians still debate whether other similar trilingual stelae might have been overlooked or destroyed during this or other periods. How many potential keys were lost because no one with Bouchard's insight was there to recognize their significance? The discovery of the Rosetta Stone, as it soon came to be called, was a moment of pure archaeological serendipity, a fortunate accident that would have profound consequences. You can feel the thrill of that moment, the dawning realization that this wasn't just another old rock, but a linguistic treasure map waiting for someone to follow its clues. The slow chisels of the ancient masons had done their work, and now, after nearly 2,000 years, the slow work of decipherment was about to begin. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone by Lieutenant Bouchard and his men in July 1799 sends a ripple of excitement through the French scholarly community in Egypt. You can imagine the savants attached to Napoleon's expedition, men dedicated to unlocking the secrets of this ancient land, flocking to see this remarkable trilingual inscription. Here at last is a potential key, a sort of ancient decoder ring that might finally unlock the mysteries of the hieroglyphs that had fascinated and frustrated European scholars for centuries. The stone is quickly transported from the dusty Fort Julian to Cairo to the Institut d'Egypte, the scholarly body Napoleon had established. You picture it there, the center of intense scrutiny, with scholars carefully cleaning its surface, making initial transcriptions, and perhaps already beginning the painstaking process of comparing the Greek text with its Egyptian counterparts. The air is thick with anticipation and the thrill of potential discovery. However, this scholarly idyll is taking place against the backdrop of war. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, though initially successful, is facing increasing pressure from the British and Ottoman forces. The French control of Egypt is far from secure. A mainstream historical fact is that the British Navy, under Admiral Nelson, had already decimated the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile in 1798, cutting off Napoleon's army from France and making their long-term position in Egypt precarious. You can feel the tension, the sense that this precious historical artifact, along with all the other antiquities and scientific data collected by the French, is now in a rather vulnerable position. It's like finding the ultimate lost treasure map, only to realize you're in the middle of a very active pirate battle. Quick, decipher the ancient wisdom before we get cannonballed. As the military situation deteriorates for the French, the fate of the Rosetta Stone and the other treasures collected by the savants becomes a point of contention. When the French forces in Egypt finally surrender to the British in 1801, the terms of that surrender, formalized in the Treaty of Alexandria, include a clause regarding these antiquities. The French, understandably, want to keep the fruits of their scholarly labors, arguing that these discoveries were made by their scientists. The British, as victors, argue that these items are spoils of war, or perhaps, with a loftier tone, that they should be preserved for the benefit of all learned nations, under British stewardship, of course. One quirky detail of this handover is the story of the French scholars initially trying to hide some of the most valuable artifacts, including the Rosetta Stone, perhaps by claiming them as private property. However, the British were insistent. The stone was considered too important to remain in French hands. So in 1801, the Rosetta Stone changes ownership. You see it being carefully crated up, not for a triumphant return to Paris, but for a journey to London. It's a significant moment, a transfer of not just a physical object, but of a potent symbol of ancient knowledge, and inevitably of imperial prestige. Historians still debate the ethics of this transfer, and indeed, the broader issue of colonial acquisition of antiquities. Was it a legitimate act under the rules of war at the time, or was it a form of cultural appropriation, removing a key piece of Egyptian heritage from its homeland? These are complex questions with no easy answers, and they continue to fuel discussions about museum collections and restitution today. For the Rosetta Stone, however, its immediate destiny is sealed.
It arrives in England in 1802 and is initially presented to King George III, who then donates it to the British Museum. You can imagine its arrival in London generating considerable public and scholarly interest. Here is the famous trilingual stone, the potential key to Egypt's lost language. It's put on public display, and scholars from across Europe eagerly await accurate copies of its inscriptions, so they too can join the race to decipherment. The stone itself, a fairly unassuming dark gray slab, now bears the painted inscriptions on its sides. Captured in Egypt by the British Army in 1801 on one side, and presented by King George III on the other, clear markers of its new context and ownership. The slow chisels that carved it in Ptolemaic Egypt could never have foreseen this long, strange journey from a temple in the Nile Delta to a fort in Rosetta, to the scholarly institutes of Cairo, and finally, to a prominent place in a burgeoning museum in a distant northern land, its true voice still locked away, waiting for the right minds to break the code. The Rosetta Stone is now safely ensconced in the British Museum, a subject of immense curiosity and scholarly ambition. You can imagine it there, perhaps under a glass case, even then, with academics and interested members of the public peering at its three distinct bands of script. The Greek section, of course, is relatively straightforward to read for classical scholars. It provides the crib, the known text against which the other two, the mysterious Demotic and the even more enigmatic Hieroglyphic, can be compared. The race to decipherment is on, and it's an international affair, with scholars across Europe eager to crack the code that has guarded the secrets of ancient Egypt for so long. The first real inroads are made not with the pictorial hieroglyphs, which still seem impossibly complex, but with the cursive Demotic script in the middle. It looks more like flowing handwriting, and scholars suspected it might be alphabetic, or at least have a stronger phonetic component than the hieroglyphs. You can picture scholars like the French Orientalist Sylvestre de Sacy, one of the leading linguists of his day, hunched over copies of the inscriptions. De Sacy, working in the early 1800s, manages to identify some proper names, like Ptolemy and Alexander, in the Demotic text by comparing their positions with the known Greek text. This is a crucial first step, showing that Demotic, at least for foreign names, used phonetic signs. A mainstream historical fact is that de Sacy correctly located the Demotic equivalents for several names found in the Greek text, a foundational contribution. However, he largely believed Demotic was primarily alphabetic and struggled to make much further progress with the rest of the script. Following de Sacy, a Swedish diplomat and scholar named Johann David Åkerblad takes up the challenge. Building on de Sacy's work, Åkerblad successfully identifies all the proper names in the Demotic section that also appeared in the Greek. He goes further, managing to identify a number of Demotic words that are clearly related to Coptic, the liturgical language of Egyptian Christians, which was known to be a late descendant of the ancient Egyptian language. Åkerblad compiles a short Demotic alphabet of about 29 signs, many of which later proved to be correct. You can feel the momentum building, a few chinks appearing in the armor of these ancient scripts. However, Åkerblad, like de Sacy, remains convinced that Demotic is almost entirely alphabetic, which ultimately limits his ability to decipher the entire script, as Demotic, like hieroglyphs, also contains non-alphabetic signs. It's like trying to understand English using only the sounds of the letters, without grasping that PH can sound like OF, or that some symbols like onend represent whole words. Then comes the brilliant English polymath, Thomas Young, physician, physicist, famous for his work on the wave theory of light and Young's modulus, and Egyptologist, Young brings a formidable intellect to the problem in the 1810s. He makes significant progress with both the demotic and, crucially, begins to tackle the hieroglyphic script. You can imagine him, with his broad scientific training, approaching it like a code-breaking puzzle. Young correctly deduces that the demotic script is not purely alphabetic, but also contains ideographic or symbolic signs. He also makes a vital observation about the hieroglyphs. He notices that certain groups of hieroglyphs are enclosed in oval shapes called cartouches. He hypothesizes correctly that these cartouches contain royal names by comparing the cartouches on the Rosetta Stone with the Greek name Ptolemaios, Ptolemy. Young is able to tentatively assign phonetic values to some of the hieroglyphic signs within that cartouche. One quirky detail about Young's work is that he published some of his findings anonymously at first, perhaps due to the competitive nature of the decipherment race or his own cautious scientific temperament. He also correctly identified the phonetic signs for the name Berenice in another cartouche. However, Young, for all his brilliance, is hampered by his underlying assumption that phonetic hieroglyphs were used only for spelling foreign names like Ptolemy or Cleopatra. He believed that the vast majority of hieroglyphs were purely symbolic or ideographic, representing whole words or ideas rather than sounds. Historians still debate why Young, having come so close, didn't make the final leap to understanding the fundamentally phonetic nature of much of the hieroglyphic script. Was it a preconceived notion about primitive picture writing? Or was he simply sidetracked by his many other scientific interests? Regardless, his contributions were immense, laying crucial groundwork. He demonstrated that hieroglyphs weren't just pretty pictures. They could represent sounds. The door to understanding was creaking open, but the full flood of light was yet to come. You can feel the academic world holding its breath, knowing they are on the verge of something monumental, the slow chisels of intellectual effort gradually wearing away at millennia of silence. The early breakthroughs by scholars like de Sacy, Åkerblad, and Thomas Young, particularly Young's identification of phonetic values within royal cartouches, send ripples of excitement and intensified effort throughout the learned circles of Europe. You can almost feel the quickening pulse of intellectual pursuit in the libraries and studies of Paris, London, Göttingen, and beyond. The Rosetta Stone, though physically in London, is intellectually everywhere, thanks to the dissemination of increasingly accurate copies of its inscriptions. The race to fully unlock the secrets of ancient Egypt is no longer a distant dream. It feels tantalizingly within reach. This isn't just a solitary pursuit. It's a vibrant, sometimes contentious, international endeavor, a fascinating mix of collaboration and intense rivalry. The atmosphere is charged with anticipation. Scholars eagerly share their findings through letters and publications, building upon each other's work, yet also competing to be the one to make the next crucial leap. You can imagine correspondence flying back and forth across the English Channel, ideas being debated, hypotheses proposed and critiqued. National pride often played a significant role, especially between Britain and France, still smarting from the recent Napoleonic Wars. The Rosetta Stone itself, captured by the British from the French, is a potent symbol of this rivalry. Whichever nation could claim the ultimate decipherment would win immense scholarly prestige. It's like the academic Olympics, but with more ink-stained fingers and fewer actual athletes. My dear fellow, your tentative phonetic values for crocodile are intriguing, but I believe my own theory regarding hippopotamus will prove far more groundbreaking. For king and country, you understand. Crucially, the Rosetta Stone isn't the only piece of the puzzle attracting attention. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, despite its military failure, had resulted in a vast trove of Egyptian antiquities and detailed recordings of inscriptions being brought back to Europe, primarily to France, published in the monumental Description de l'Égypte. You can picture scholars poring over these beautifully illustrated volumes, which provided a wealth of new material. Inscriptions from temple walls, obelisks, statues, and papyri. A mainstream historical fact is that these other inscriptions, especially those that were also bilingual or contained recognizable names, provided crucial comparative material for testing the tentative decipherments derived from the Rosetta Stone.
One particularly important artifact in this regard was an obelisk from Philae, often called the Banks Obelisk, brought to England by William John Banks in the 1820s. This obelisk had a hieroglyphic inscription and, significantly, a Greek inscription on its base, which mentioned the names Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Thomas Young had already worked on the Ptolemy cartouche from the Rosetta Stone. The Banks obelisk provided a confirmed Cleopatra cartouche in hieroglyphs alongside its Greek equivalent. You can imagine scholars out eagerly comparing the signs in these two royal names, looking for shared phonetic values. The sign for P in Ptolemy, for example, should also appear in Cleopatra. The sign for L should be in both. This cross-referencing was vital. One quirky detail is the sheer intellectual detective work involved. It was like solving a massive Sudoku puzzle where most of the numbers were unknown, and you weren't even sure what language the numbers were in, or if they were numbers at all. The study of Coptic, the liturgical language of Egyptian Christians, also continued to be recognized as essential. Coptic, as you know, is the last stage of the ancient Egyptian language, written with the Greek alphabet, plus a few extra characters derived from Demotic. Scholars increasingly realized that if hieroglyphs and Demotic represented earlier stages of the same language, then Coptic could provide vital clues to the vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation of ancient Egyptian. Historians still debate the exact moment when the full significance of Coptic for decipherment was universally grasped by all the key players. While its importance was noted early on, consistently applying Coptic knowledge to unlock the phonetic and semantic values of the older scripts was a complex process. You can feel the scholarly world buzzing like a hive of very intelligent bees, all focused on these ancient symbols, each new fragment, each new inscription, each new linguistic insight, adding another piece to the grand, emerging picture of Egypt's lost voice. The air is thick with potential, the final breakthrough just waiting for the right mind, with the right approach, to put all the clues together. The path towards deciphering ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, even with the Rosetta Stone and other inscriptions providing tantalizing clues, was far from smooth or straightforward. You can imagine the intellectual landscape of the early 19th century littered with false starts, ingenious but ultimately incorrect theories, and the sheer, dogged persistence of scholars grappling with a system of writing that had remained silent for the better part of 1500 years. It wasn't just a matter of matching up Greek letters to hieroglyphic pictures. The fundamental nature of the hieroglyphic script was itself a profound mystery. For centuries, the prevailing view among many European scholars, inherited from late classical writers and Renaissance Neoplatonists, was that Egyptian hieroglyphs were purely symbolic or allegorical, representing mystical ideas or philosophical concepts rather than spoken language. Thinkers like Athanasius Kircher in the 17th century, for example, produced elaborate, imaginative translations of hieroglyphic texts that were entirely fanciful, based on the idea that each sign was a profound philosophical emblem. You can picture these early attempts, earnest but misguided, like someone trying to understand modern computer code by assuming every icon on their desktop is a deep spiritual metaphor. Ah, the little trash can icon. Clearly, it represents the ephemeral nature of earthly existence and the cyclical process of decay and renewal. While this mystical approach had largely faded by the early 19th century, the underlying assumption that hieroglyphs were primarily ideographic, representing whole words or ideas with single pictures, still held considerable sway and proved to be a major stumbling block. Even as Thomas Young made his breakthroughs, correctly identifying phonetic values in royal names, he too, as you know, was largely convinced that this phonetic usage was a late, limited development, used mainly for spelling foreign names. The sheer number and variety of hieroglyphic signs, hundreds of them, depicting animals, birds, human figures, objects, and geometric shapes, seem to argue against a simple alphabetic system. A mainstream historical fact is that the Egyptian hieroglyphic system is actually a complex mix. Some signs are indeed phonetic, representing 1, 2, or even 3 consonants. Some are ideograms, representing a whole word or idea with a picture, and some are determinatives, silent signs placed at the end of a word to indicate its general category, like a seated man for man, or person, or a wavy line for water or liquid. Untangling this intricate system was the core challenge. You can imagine the frustration. Scholars would painstakingly compare the Greek text of the Rosetta Stone with the hieroglyphic section, trying to isolate groups of signs that might correspond to known Greek words. But without understanding the underlying principles, that many signs represented sounds, not just ideas, and that vowels were generally not written, progress was agonizingly slow and often led to dead ends. One quirky detail is the sheer creativity and sometimes desperation in some of the proposed interpretations. If a hieroglyph depicted a goose, did it mean goose or sun? Because the Coptic word for sun sounded similar to a word for goose, or did it represent a flight of fancy, a divine message, or the concept of migration? The possibilities seemed endless, and without a firm grammatical or phonetic framework, it was like navigating a vast ocean without a compass. Historians still debate the impact of national rivalries and personal academic jealousies on the pace of decipherment. Did the desire to be the first to crack the code sometimes lead scholars to cling to their own theories too stubbornly, or to be overly critical of the work of rivals? It's certainly a very human element in any great scientific or intellectual endeavor. You can feel the immense pressure, the weight of expectation from the learned world, and the profound desire to be the one to finally give voice to ancient Egypt. Each new inscription that came to light, each new copy of the Rosetta Stone that was circulated, provided more data, but also more complexity, more potential pitfalls. The slow chisels of the ancient stone carvers had created a monumental puzzle, and now the slow chisels of intellectual effort were chipping away at it. But the core key, the Rosetta Stone of understanding the hieroglyphic system itself, remained elusive, just beyond their grasp, waiting for a final, brilliant insight. The intellectual stage is set. The Rosetta Stone and other inscriptions have yielded some tantalizing clues, but the fundamental nature of Egyptian hieroglyphs remains shrouded in mystery. Scholars across Europe are wrestling with the puzzle, their efforts marked by brilliant insights, frustrating dead ends, and intense rivalries. And now, into this charged atmosphere steps the figure who will ultimately provide the definitive breakthrough, Jean-François Champollion. You can almost see him, a young, ferociously intelligent Frenchman, his mind consumed by a lifelong passion for ancient Egypt and its lost language. He is the final, crucial key to unlocking millennia of silence. Champollion, born in 1790, was a linguistic prodigy. By his teenage years, he had already mastered a dazzling array of ancient languages, including Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, Chaldean, and crucially, Coptic. You can picture him as a youth, not out playing games, but devouring grammars and dictionaries, his imagination fired by the allure of the ancient Near East, particularly Egypt. From a very early age, he was captivated by the hieroglyphs, convinced that Coptic, the liturgical language of Egyptian Christians, held the key to understanding them, believing it to be a direct descendant of the ancient Egyptian tongue spoken by those who carved the mysterious symbols. This conviction would prove to be absolutely vital. A mainstream historical fact is that Champollion's profound knowledge of Coptic gave him a significant advantage, allowing him to recognize the phonetic values of hieroglyphic signs once he began to identify them, because he could often link them to known Coptic words. He wasn't working in a vacuum, of course. Champollion was well aware of the work of his predecessors, including Sylvestre de Sacy, Okerblad, and Thomas Young. He studied their publications, acknowledged their contributions, but also critically evaluated their limitations. You can imagine him poring over copies of the Rosetta Stone inscription, the inscriptions from the Banks obelisk with its cartouches of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, and countless other hieroglyphic texts meticulously copied from Egyptian monuments. Unlike Young, who largely believed phonetic hieroglyphs were a late development used only for foreign names, Champollion began to suspect that the phonetic principle was much more integral to the entire hieroglyphic system. It's like he had a different operating system in his brain, one more attuned to the linguistic possibilities. These pictures aren't just standing for ideas, he might have muttered to himself. They have to sound like something. His process was one of intense, almost obsessive study and methodical comparison. He painstakingly collected examples of cartouches, knowing they contained royal names. He systematically analyzed the signs within them, comparing known Greek names like Ptolemy and Cleopatra with their hieroglyphic counterparts, trying to build up a reliable alphabet of phonetic hieroglyphs. One quirky detail is that Champollion was fiercely competitive, particularly with Thomas Young. While Young had made crucial early steps, Champollion was determined to be the one to fully crack the code, and there was a considerable intellectual and nationalistic rivalry between them. It was the early 19th century equivalent of a heated academic Twitter feud, but played out in scholarly journals and private correspondence. Champollion's breakthrough didn't come in a single flash of inspiration with the Rosetta Stone alone, but was a gradual dawning, a piecing together of evidence from multiple sources. He realized that the hieroglyphic script was not purely alphabetic, nor purely ideographic, but a complex mixture. Some signs represented sounds, phonograms, some represented whole words or ideas, ideograms, and some were silent determinatives that helped clarify the meaning of a word. Historians still debate the exact moment or specific insight that constituted his eureka moment. Was it his work on the names Ptolemy and Cleopatra confirming phonetic values? Or was it when he successfully deciphered the names of earlier native Egyptian pharaohs like Ramses and Thutmose, proving that the phonetic principle applied not just to foreign names, but to the core of the ancient Egyptian language? This latter step was crucial as it broke through Young's limiting assumption. You can feel the immense intellectual effort, the years of focused dedication, the countless hours spent staring at these enigmatic symbols, slowly, painstakingly, beginning to make them speak again. The silence of centuries was about to be shattered, the culmination of Jean-François Champollion's relentless efforts, that moment when the intricate lock of Egyptian hieroglyphs finally clicked open, is one of the most celebrated breakthroughs in intellectual history. You can imagine him in Paris in September of 1822, surrounded by copies of inscriptions, his mind racing, pieces of the puzzle falling into place with dizzying speed. He had been working intensely on cartouches containing the names of pharaohs known from Greek and other historical sources, like Ramses and Thutmose. The crucial insight building upon his understanding of phonetic values from Ptolemaic names was recognizing that these same phonetic principles applied to the names of native Egyptian rulers as well. This was the leap that had eluded others. He famously deciphered the cartouche of Ramses by identifying phonetic signs that corresponded to Ra, the sun god, represented by a sun disk hieroglyph, Emis, a sign he had identified, and Es, another sign. He then confirmed this by deciphering Thutmose in a similar fashion. Legend has it that upon making this definitive breakthrough, realizing he had cracked the code not just for Greek names, but for the entire hieroglyphic system as it applied to the 2000 Egyptian language itself, he rushed to his brother Jacques Joseph, a fellow scholar and his unwavering supporter, burst into his office, dramatically declared, "Je tiens l'affaire," I've got it, and promptly fainted from sheer exhaustion and excitement. Whether the fainting part is entirely accurate or a later embellishment, it certainly captures the emotional intensity of such a monumental discovery. You can almost feel his heart pounding, the overwhelming flood of realization that he, Jean-François Champollion, had unlocked the voices of a civilization that had been silent for nearly 1,500 years. A mainstream historical fact is that on September 27th, 1822, Champollion presented his findings in his famous Lettre Monsieur Dacier, a letter addressed to Bon Joseph Dacier, the secretary of the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres in Paris. In this letter, he outlined his system of decipherment, demonstrating how hieroglyphs were a complex but coherent system combining phonetic signs, representing sounds, ideographic signs, representing whole words or ideas, and determinative signs, clarifying the meaning of a word. The Lettre à Monsieur Dacier was a bombshell in the scholarly world. It provided the essential framework for reading ancient Egyptian. You can imagine the excitement as copies of the letter circulated. Scholars who had struggled for years with the enigmatic script suddenly had a key, a methodology. The Rosetta Stone, while still crucial as a confirmatory tool, had now been surpassed by a system that could, in theory, unlock all hieroglyphic texts. The impact was immediate and profound. Ancient Egypt, which had previously been understood primarily through the often biased or incomplete accounts of Greek and Roman historians, or through its silent, imposing monuments, could now begin to speak for itself through its own voluminous writings. One quirky detail is that Champollion's system, though revolutionary, wasn't instantly accepted by everyone without reservation. There was still some skepticism, particularly from supporters of Thomas Young in Britain, who felt that Young's earlier contributions, especially regarding the phonetic values in royal names, were being downplayed by Champollion or his French champions. National rivalries, as ever, played their part. Historians still debate the precise balance of credit between Young and Champollion. Young undeniably made crucial early breakthroughs. However, it was Champollion who fully grasped the mixed nature of the hieroglyphic system and successfully applied it to deciphering not just foreign names, but the entire Egyptian language, crucially using his deep knowledge of Coptic to confirm phonetic values and understand grammar. Champollion's system was far more comprehensive and ultimately correct. You can feel the intellectual ferment of the time, the vigorous debates, the slow process of academic acceptance, as Champollion and his supporters provided more and more evidence of the validity of his system by successfully translating other inscriptions. The door to understanding ancient Egypt had been thrown wide open, and the treasures that lay beyond, its history, its religion, its literature, its daily life, were now, for the first time in well over a millennium, accessible. The slow chisels of the stone carvers who created the Rosetta Stone had, through the slow chisels of Champollion's intellect, finally yielded their ultimate secret. Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphs in 1822 was more than just an academic triumph. It was like finding a master keys to a vast forgotten library, the library of ancient Egyptian civilization itself. You can imagine the intellectual landscape irrevocably altered. Suddenly, the inscriptions on temple walls, obelisks, papyri, and tomb paintings, which had been mute, enigmatic decorations for centuries, began to speak. A whole civilization, with its complex history, its rich mythology, its sophisticated literature, and its intimate details of daily life, started to emerge from the mists of time. The Rosetta Stone, the catalyst for this incredible unlocking, had fulfilled its ultimate unintended destiny. The impact was, and continues to be, immense. Egyptology as a serious academic discipline was born. Scholars could now read the accounts of pharaohs in their own words, study religious hymns, medical texts, legal documents, love poems, and even mundane laundry lists, all preserved in hieroglyphic or hieratic script. A mainstream historical fact is that our understanding of virtually every aspect of ancient Egyptian culture, from its dynastic history and political structures to its religious beliefs and scientific knowledge, has been profoundly shaped and enriched by the ability to read its written records, an ability directly unlocked by the Rosetta Stone and Champollion's genius. It's like a whole new wing of human history was suddenly illuminated. The Rosetta Stone itself, having played its pivotal role in the decipherment, became an icon. You see it today, a centerpiece exhibit in the British Museum in London, viewed by millions of visitors each year. It's arguably one of the most famous museum artifacts in the world, a symbol of linguistic breakthroughs and the recovery of lost knowledge. Its image is instantly recognizable. One quirky detail is that despite its fame, the actual text of the Memphis Decree inscribed on the stone is, as you know, not particularly thrilling. It's mostly priestly affirmations and tax exemptions for Ptolemy V. Its true significance lies not in what it says, but in the fact that it says it in 3 scripts, providing that crucial parallel text. It's the ancient equivalent of a very dry government document that just happens to hold the key to understanding an entire alien language. Exciting news, everyone! We've deciphered the ancient texts. Turns out it's mostly about tax breaks for temple endowments. But hey, we can read it. However, the Rosetta Stone's location in London remains a subject of ongoing discussion and controversy. Egypt has, on several occasions, formally requested the repatriation of the stone, arguing that it is a vital piece of Egyptian cultural heritage that was removed during a period of foreign occupation. You can understand the strong emotional and national significance it holds for Egypt. The British Museum, on the other hand, has generally argued that the stone is part of a global collection, accessible to a vast international audience, and that its presence in London allowed it to be studied in the context of other world cultures. Historians and ethicists still debate the complex issues surrounding the ownership and display of cultural artifacts acquired during colonial periods. Will the Rosetta Stone ever return to Egypt? Only time will tell. Regardless of its physical location, the enduring legacy of the Rosetta Stone is its power as a symbol. It represents the thrill of discovery, the patient unraveling of ancient mysteries, and the profound human desire to connect with the past. It reminds us that even civilizations that seem lost to time can have their voices restored through scholarship, dedication, and sometimes a lucky find in the rubble of an old fort. The slow chisels of those Ptolemaic stonemasons, working nearly 2 centuries before the Common Era, and the equally slow, patient chisels of intellectual effort applied by scholars like Young and decisively Champollion, combined to give us back the vibrant, fascinating world of ancient Egypt. The silence of the hieroglyphs was broken, and the conversation with that ancient culture continues to this day. Now, as our exploration of the Rosetta Stone and its remarkable journey concludes, let the images of ancient scripts, dusty discoveries, and scholarly breakthroughs gently fade from your mind. The story of this iconic stone, a key to a lost world, can now become a soft, receding echo, a quiet whisper from the distant past, as you prepare for your own peaceful rest. Allow the thought of those intricate hieroglyphs, once an impenetrable mystery, to transform into a symbol of the gentle unraveling of your own thoughts as you drift towards sleep. The efforts of the French soldiers digging in the Egyptian sun and the scholars poring over ancient texts can now give way to the stillness and comfort of your own quiet space. The weight of centuries of silence surrounding ancient Egypt, now broken, can be replaced by the peaceful silence of your room, inviting deep relaxation. Any lingering questions about the precise meaning of the Memphis Decree or the complexities of Ptolemaic politics can now dissolve, unimportant for this moment of rest. There are no more ancient languages to decipher, no more historical debates to resolve. There is only the gentle descent into slumber, the promise of renewal. The Rosetta Stone, having unlocked so many secrets, now becomes a quiet symbol of understanding and peace in your mind. Allow yourself to drift, like a papyrus boat on the Nile of your dreams, into a deep and untroubled sleep. Hey friends, tonight we are digging into a story of colossal bones, colossal egos, and a scientific rivalry so bitter it makes your average office feud look like a polite disagreement over a shared stapler. Imagine two brilliant, ambitious paleontologists in the late 19th century racing across the American West, not just to unearth prehistoric giants, but to metaphorically bury each other in a flurry of fossils, accusations, and scientific papers. That's the dramatic and often downright dirty saga of the bone wars we're unearthing tonight. You're probably thinking, dinosaur hunting sounds exciting, and it was, in a rugged, adventurous sort of way. But let's be honest, dropped into the Wild West with pickaxes and dynamite, facing harsh conditions, rival fossil hunters who might sabotage your dig site, and two incredibly driven bosses who demanded results and hated each other's guts. You probably wouldn't survive the back-breaking labor, the academic backstabbing, or the sheer unrelenting pettiness of it all. It makes the competition for a parking spot seem rather tame, so before you get too comfortable, go ahead and take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're all tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below. Now turn off your lights, turn on your fan for some gentle white noise, and let's begin tonight's journey. You find yourself in the latter half of the 19th century, a period of immense growth and ambition in the United States, often called the Gilded Age. The Civil War is over. The Transcontinental Railroad is stretching its iron tentacles across the continent, and the vast, rugged landscapes of the American West are opening up, revealing not just opportunities for settlers and entrepreneurs, but also secrets that have lain hidden for millions of years. The fossilized remains of dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures. It's a time when American science is also coming into its own, with new museums and universities eager to build their collections and reputations. And at the forefront of this exciting, burgeoning field of vertebrate paleontology are two men whose names would become inextricably and often infamously linked: Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. Let's meet our protagonists. Othniel Charles Marsh, or O.C. Marsh as he's often known, is a rather stern, methodical, and well-connected figure. Born into a modest New York farming family, his fortunes changed dramatically when his wealthy uncle, the philanthropist George Peabody took an interest in him. You can picture Marsh, perhaps with a neat beard and a determined glint in his eye, using his uncle's patronage to secure a position as professor of paleontology at Yale University, one of the first such professorships in America, and to establish the Peabody Museum of Natural History. He is meticulous, well organized, and has a knack for fundraising and institution building. He is also, as we shall see, fiercely ambitious and not above using his connections and resources to gain an advantage. On the other side of this eventual feud is Edward Drinker Cope. Cope is, in many ways, Marsh's opposite. Born into a wealthy Quaker family in Philadelphia, he is brilliant, precocious, and incredibly prolific, publishing a staggering number of scientific papers throughout his career. You can imagine him as a more flamboyant, perhaps somewhat erratic genius with an encyclopedic knowledge of natural history and a restless energy. He inherited considerable wealth, which he initially used to fund his own expeditions and research. Cope is known for his quick mind, his sharp observational skills, and his ability to rapidly describe and name new species. He is also, however, more impulsive than Marsh, less organized in his fieldwork, and, as it turns out, possessed of a temper and a competitive streak that rivaled Marsh's own. A mainstream historical fact is that both Marsh and Cope were initially amicable, even friendly, when they first met in Europe in the 1860s. They shared a passion for natural history and corresponded, naming species after each other in the collegial tradition of science. But this early camaraderie would soon curdle into one of the most bitter and protracted rivalries in the history of science. The stage for their conflict was set by the incredible fossil discoveries being made in North America. While dinosaur bones had been found before, the sheer scale and richness of the fossil beds being uncovered in places like New Jersey, and then later in the vast unexplored territories of the West, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, was unprecedented. These weren't just isolated fragments. These were near-complete skeletons of gigantic, previously unimagined creatures. You can feel the excitement of the time, the sense that America was the new frontier, not just for settlement, but for paleontological discovery, a chance to unearth a lost world and bring its monstrous inhabitants to light. The allure of naming these magnificent beasts, of building grand museum displays that would awe the public and advance scientific knowledge, was irresistible to men like Marsh and Cope. One quirky detail from this early period, before the Bone Wars truly erupted, is that Cope purchased a quarry in the marl pits of Haddonfield, New Jersey, where the first nearly complete dinosaur skeleton in North America, Hadrosaurus folki, had been discovered. He was eager to find more treasures there, setting the stage for early competition when Marsh also began to show interest in the fossil riches of the East Coast. The battle lines were being subtly drawn, even if neither man yet fully realized the scale of the conflict that was to come. The quiet, patient work of unearthing ancient bones was about to get very noisy indeed. The initial collegial relationship between O.C. Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, those two titans of American paleontology, didn't just gradually cool, it spectacularly imploded thanks to a series of unfortunate events and clashing egos that would set the stage for decades of bitter rivalry. You can almost pinpoint the moments when the polite facade of scientific collaboration began to crack, revealing the fierce ambition and personal animosity lurking beneath. One of the most famous and arguably most humiliating for Cope incidents occurred early in their careers concerning a magnificent marine reptile called Elasmosaurus platyrus. Picture this. It's the late 1860s. Cope has recently described this fantastic new creature, a long-necked plesiosaur from fossils found in Kansas. He's rushed to publish, eager to announce his discovery to the scientific world. He even has a full skeletal reconstruction drawn up. Marsh, still on relatively friendly terms with Cope, visits him in Philadelphia to see the specimen. As Marsh examines the reconstructed skeleton, he makes a rather startling observation. Cope has mistakenly placed the skull on the end of the creature's short tail rather than on its incredibly long neck. You can imagine the scene. Marsh, perhaps with a touch of academic relish, pointing out this rather fundamental error to the proud and probably mortified Cope. To make matters worse, the renowned anatomist Joseph Leidy, a mentor to Cope, also confirmed Marsh's assessment. A mainstream historical fact is that Cope, deeply embarrassed, frantically tried to recall the incorrect publications and suppress the error, but the damage was done. Marsh, it is said, never let Cope forget this blunder. It was a public humiliation that Cope, with his considerable pride, would have found incredibly galling. It's like a modern-day scientist publishing a groundbreaking paper only to have their biggest rival point out that their key diagram is hilariously upside down, and then everyone on scientific Twitter retweets it. Awkward. This incident, while perhaps not the sole cause, certainly poured fuel on the simmering embers of their rivalry. Their competition intensified in the fossil-rich marl pits of New Jersey, where, as you know, important early dinosaur and marine reptile discoveries were being made. Both men employed local collectors and vied for access to the best sites. You can picture them, or their hired agents, scrambling to secure new finds, sometimes working in close proximity, the air thick with suspicion. Stories began to circulate of one camp trying to outbid or mislead the other, of valuable specimens being spirited away before the rival could get to them. One quirky detail from this period is that some of these marl pits were owned by private companies, and the paleontologists had to negotiate access, sometimes leading to exclusive deals that would lock out their competitor. It added a layer of commercial intrigue to the scientific pursuit. But it was the opening of the vast fossil fields of the American West in the 1870s that truly escalated the bone wars into full-blown conflict. Discoveries in places like Como Bluff in Wyoming and Morrison, Colorado, revealed an astonishing abundance of gigantic dinosaur skeletons, far surpassing anything found in the East. You can feel the magnetic pull of these new territories, a veritable bone rush. Both Marsh and Cope, now openly hostile, dispatched teams of fossil hunters into these remote and often dangerous regions. These weren't just polite academic expeditions anymore. They were often secretive, well-funded operations. Historians still debate the extent to which Marsh and Cope personally directed or were even aware of all the underhanded tactics employed by their field agents in the heat of competition. Were the bosses explicitly ordering sabotage and theft, or were there ambitious and poorly paid collectors sometimes taking matters into their own hands to secure bonuses or curry favor? Regardless, the result was an atmosphere of intense paranoia and dirty tricks. The West wasn't just wild because of cowboys and outlaws. It was also wild because of these bone-obsessed paleontologists and their crews. The era of gentlemanly science was rapidly being replaced by a no-holds-barred scramble for prehistoric plunder, and the friendship between Marsh and Cope was now just another fossil buried under layers of resentment and ambition. The discovery of the immense fossil beds in the American West in the 1870s acts like a starting gun for the most intense phase of the Bone Wars. You can imagine O.C. Marsh at Yale with his Peabody Museum funds, and Edward Drinker Cope in Philadelphia, using his own wealth and connections, both recognizing that this is where the great paleontological prizes are to be won. Their rivalry, already simmering from earlier clashes like the Elasmosaurus incident and competition in New Jersey, now has a vast new arena. It's no longer just about individual discoveries. It's about establishing dominance in American paleontology, about amassing the largest and most spectacular collections of prehistoric life. The scale of their ambition is as colossal as the dinosaurs they sought. Both Marsh and Cope begin to organize and dispatch expeditions to the newly discovered fossil fields, places that would become legendary in the history of paleontology. Como Bluff and Bone Cabin Quarry in Wyoming, Morrison and Canyon City in Colorado, the Judith River Formation in Montana. These are remote, rugged territories, often difficult to access and work in. You can picture their field crews, a motley assortment of local guides, laborers, and aspiring young paleontologists, enduring harsh weather, basic living conditions, and sometimes even the danger of encounters with hostile Native American tribes or outlaws. It's a far cry from the genteel studies and museums back east. A mainstream historical fact is that these expeditions were often funded for extended periods, with teams spending months, even years in the field, meticulously excavating and crating up tons of fossilized bones for shipment back to New Haven or Philadelphia. Secrecy becomes paramount. If one camp discovers a particularly rich fossil site, they try to keep its location quiet for as long as possible to prevent the other from moving in. You might see letters written in coded language or instructions to field agents to be deliberately vague about their exact whereabouts. The hiring of local collectors and informants becomes crucial. Both Marsh and Cope employ networks of people to scout for new locations and to keep an eye on what the rival camp is up to. Loyalty is prized, but sometimes collectors are lured away with promises of better pay or more exciting finds, or they might even act as double agents, feeding information to both sides. It's an atmosphere ripe for suspicion and intrigues. One quirky detail is the use of rather colorful characters as fossil hunters. Men like William Harlow Reed, a railroad foreman and self-taught fossil collector who worked for Marsh at Como Bluff, or David Baldwin, who collected for both Marsh and Cope at different times in New Mexico and elsewhere, were rugged individuals, well suited to the demanding conditions of the frontier, but not always adhering to the polite conventions of academic science. Historians still debate the degree to which Marsh and Cope personally micromanaged their field operations from afar. While they both made trips to the West, much of the day-to-day work and many of the on-the-ground decisions were left to their chief collectors. Did they explicitly encourage the more underhanded tactics that began to emerge, or did they simply turn a blind eye as long as the bones kept coming in? The pressure for results was immense. The race was on to discover and name the most impressive new dinosaurs, the largest, the fiercest, the most bizarre. You can feel the growing obsession, the sense that this is more than just science. It's a personal vendetta being played out on a continental scale with fossilized giants as the pawns. The sleepy academic world of paleontology is being transformed into a high-stakes, often cutthroat competition fueled by ambition, jealousy, and the thrill of unearthing a lost world. The battle lines are drawn across the geological formations of the West, and the bone wars are about to enter their most ferocious and destructive phase. The battle lines are drawn, the field crews are deployed, and the bone wars now enter their most notorious phase, a period of intense, often ruthless competition in the fossil-rich badlands of the American West. You can feel the shift in atmosphere from mere academic rivalry to something more akin to industrial espionage, mixed with a dash of Wild West skullduggery. O.C. Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, from their respective academic strongholds in New Haven and Philadelphia, are like rival generals, directing their forces in a relentless campaign for paleontological supremacy. The prize? Not just scientific glory, but the public's imagination, captivated by the discovery of these colossal, previously unimagined prehistoric beasts. The tactics employed in the field become increasingly underhanded. You might see one team, having discovered a promising quarry, trying to work in secret, perhaps even covering their diggings at night to avoid detection by scouts from the rival camp. Spies are allegedly employed. Rumors fly of field hands being bribed to reveal the location of rich bone beds, or even to sabotage the efforts of their employers. There are accounts, some perhaps exaggerated by the passage of time and the heat of the rivalry, of fossil shipments being mysteriously misdirected, or even of dynamite being used to destroy less productive parts of a quarry. Not just to excavate, but to prevent the rival team from finding anything of value if they stumbled upon the site later. It's a level of animosity that seems almost comical if it weren't for the potential destruction of priceless scientific evidence. Imagine a modern scientist rigging a competitor's lab equipment to explode if they get too close to a breakthrough. It's that kind of energy, but with pickaxes and blasting powder. Oh, you found a nearly complete Stegosaurus? What a shame if a small, carefully placed explosion were to refossilize it into smaller, less identifiable pieces. A mainstream historical fact from this era is the incredible speed with which new species were being discovered and named. Both Marsh and Cope, eager to claim credit, would often rush their descriptions into print, sometimes based on incomplete or poorly understood specimens. This led to a proliferation of new dinosaur names, some of which would later turn out to be synonyms, different names given to the same species, or based on juvenile forms or misidentified bones. The scientific literature of the time becomes a confusing flurry of announcements, counter-announcements, and pointed critiques of the other's work. You can almost picture them, pens scratching furiously, trying to get their latest discovery published before the other could claim a similar find. The famed Morrison Formation, a vast layer of Jurassic Age sedimentary rock stretching across several western states, becomes a key battleground. Sites like Como Bluff in Wyoming and Morrison in Canyon City in Colorado yield an astonishing array of iconic dinosaurs. Marsh's teams, often well-funded and meticulously organized, thanks to his Yale connections and Peabody funding, unearthed giants like Allosaurus, Stegosaurus, Apatosaurus, and Diplodocus. You can imagine the excitement as these colossal skeletons are painstakingly excavated, jacketed in plaster and burlap, and then transported by wagon and rail back east to the Peabody Museum. Cope, often operating with less financial stability, but driven by his own fierce intellect and energy, also makes significant finds, including Camarasaurus and the famously sail-backed Dimetrodon, though this latter creature was actually a synapsid, a mammal ancestor, not a dinosaur. One quirky detail is that the sheer size and strangeness of these creatures led to some initial bewilderment, even among the scientists. Reconstructing these skeletons, figuring out how these enormous animals lived and moved, was a monumental task, and mistakes were sometimes made, as Cope had learned to his chagrin with Elasmosaurus. Historians still debate the extent to which the destructive tactics actually hampered the overall progress of paleontology. While some fossils were undoubtedly lost or damaged due to the haste and animosity, the sheer volume of material collected during the Bone Wars was unprecedented and formed the foundation of American vertebrate paleontology for generations to come. Was the intense competition, despite its ugliness, also a driver of rapid discovery, pushing both men and their teams to explore more territory and dig more fossils than they might have done in a more collaborative environment? It's a classic ends versus means argument, played out with giant fossilized bones. You can feel the raw, untamed energy of this period, a scientific gold rush where the stakes were high, the personalities were larger than life, and the fossils were, quite literally, colossal. The high-altitude, windswept plains and rugged badlands of Wyoming and Colorado become the epicenter of the Bone Wars. You find yourself at a place like Como Bluff, Wyoming, a long, low ridge that would become one of the most famous dinosaur graveyards in the world. It's the late 1870s, and this seemingly desolate spot is now a hive of activity, albeit secretive and highly competitive activity. Rival quarry crews, employed by Marsh and Cope, are working in close proximity, sometimes within sight of each other, their camps pitched against the harsh elements. You can feel the tension in the dry, dusty air, a mixture of excitement at the incredible discoveries being made and a constant, wary vigilance against the other side. Life in these fossil camps is incredibly arduous. You picture the bone hunters, men like William H. Reed or Arthur Lakes working for Marsh, or Samuel Wendell Williston and Charles Hazelius Sternberg, who collected for Cope, and sometimes even Marsh, in a testament to the shifting allegiances, enduring brutal winters with deep snow and sub-zero temperatures, and scorching summers with relentless sun and scarce water. Their living quarters are rudimentary, tents, rough shacks, or even dugouts. Food is basic, often monotonous, and the work itself is backbreaking. Hours spent swinging pickaxes and shovels to remove tons of overlying rock, then the delicate, painstaking process of exposing and extracting fragile, often enormous, fossilized bones. A mainstream historical fact is that the fossils were often encased in heavy, plaster and burlap jackets before being laboriously transported by wagon to the nearest railway station, sometimes hundreds of miles away, for shipment east. It was a logistical nightmare, long before the days of helicopters or heavy machinery. The pressure from their patrons, Marsh and Cope, back in their comfortable East Coast institutions is immense. You can imagine the letters and telegrams arriving, urging the field crews to find more, find bigger, find newer specimens, and above all, to find them before the other camp does. Both paleontologists are desperate to outdo each other in the number and spectacle of their discoveries. This leads to that frantic pace of naming new species. A newly discovered bone, sometimes just a fragment, might be quickly assigned a new genus and species name and rushed into a brief publication, often just to stake a claim. This resulted in a bewildering proliferation of names. One quirky detail is the sheer number of species that Marsh and Cope named that later turned out to be invalid. Either they were synonyms for already known species, sometimes even species named by their rival, or they were based on insufficient material or were misidentified. For instance, Marsh's famous Brontosaurus excelsus would eventually be shown to be an Apatosaurus with the wrong skull attached, likely a Camarasaurus skull, a colossal blunder that took decades to correct, though Brontosaurus somehow captured the public imagination more effectively and still lingers. It's like a paleontological rap battle where they're just throwing out names as fast as they can, hoping some of them stick. I see your Gigantosaurus and raise you a Monoclonius. Oh wait, that one's probably just a juvenile Centrosaurus. My bad. The field crews themselves are caught in the middle of this academic feud. Their loyalty is primarily to their paycheck and the excitement of discovery, but they are keenly aware of the rivalry. You hear stories of one crew trying to spy on another's dig site, or of workers being instructed to destroy any fossils they couldn't excavate just to prevent them from falling into the rival's hands. Historians still debate the frequency and severity of these acts of sabotage. Were they common occurrences or isolated incidents exaggerated by rumor and the passage of time? What is certain is that the atmosphere was one of deep distrust. Imagine carefully excavating a prize specimen, only to worry that the rival camp might sneak in at night to damage it or steal your tools. Despite the often unpleasant competition, the scientific payoff is undeniable. From Como Bluff and other sites in the Morrison Formation, an incredible bestiary of the Jurassic period is emerging. Marsh's team unearths iconic dinosaurs like Stegosaurus with its distinctive plates and Thagomizer, the long-necked giants Apatosaurus and Diplodocus, and the fearsome predator Allosaurus. Cope's crews are also making major finds, including different species of sauropods and theropods. The sheer scale of these creatures is astounding, capturing the imagination of the public and fueling a popular fascination with dinosaurs that endures to this day. The museums back east are slowly filling with these ancient behemoths, testament to the incredible richness of the fossil record in the American West, and to the relentless, if often ruthless, drive of the two men at the heart of the Bone Wars. The Bone Wars weren't just fought with pickaxes and shovels in the dusty Badlands. They were also waged with dollars and cents, with institutional clout, and with the increasingly sharp pens of scientific publications and even the popular press. You can see O.C. Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope deploying vastly different resources in their relentless quest for paleontological dominance. Marsh, with his Yale professorship and the backing of his wealthy uncle George Peabody, had a significant institutional advantage. The Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale became his fortress, a repository for the tons of fossils his team shipped back from the West. You can imagine him, a shrewd operator, leveraging his connections and Yale's prestige to secure funding and support for his expeditions. Later in the feud, Marsh would also gain a powerful position with the U.S. Geological Survey, eventually becoming its chief vertebrate paleontologist. A mainstream historical fact is that this government affiliation gave him access to federal funding, logistical support, like military escorts in some cases, and even a degree of authority over fossil collecting on public lands, an advantage he was not shy about using against Cope. Cope, on the other hand, started out as independently wealthy, inheriting a considerable fortune that he poured enthusiastically into his passion for natural history, funding his own expeditions and purchasing fossils. You can picture him in his element, a whirlwind of activity, traveling, collecting, and writing at a furious pace, unconstrained by institutional bureaucracy in these early years. However, Cope's financial acumen didn't always match his scientific brilliance. He made some unfortunate investments, particularly in silver mining, and gradually his personal fortune began to dwindle. This financial strain would become a significant factor as the Bone Wars dragged on, putting him at an increasing disadvantage compared to the well-funded Marsh. It's the classic David versus Goliath. If David was also a brilliant but somewhat financially reckless paleontologist, and Goliath had a university and the federal government on his side. Oh, you need more money for your dig, Cope? Perhaps you should have invested less in that guaranteed silver mine and more in, say, an actual salary. The scientific journals of the day became another battleground. Both Marsh and Cope rushed to publish descriptions of their latest finds, often in brief preliminary notices to establish priority in naming new species. The American Journal of Science, closely associated with Yale, often featured Marsh's discoveries. Cope, for a time, was an editor of the American Naturalist and used it as a vehicle for his own publications and occasionally to critique Marsh. You can imagine the academic sniping, the thinly veiled, and sometimes not so veiled attacks on each other's competence, the disputes over classification, and the accusations of errors or even unethical practices. One quirky detail is the sheer speed and sometimes carelessness of these publications. In their haste to outdo each other, they would occasionally name species based on very fragmentary material, leading to taxonomic chaos that later paleontologists would spend decades trying to untangle. The list of synonyms, different names given to the same species by one or both of them, grew almost as long as some of the sauropod necks they were unearthing. The feud wasn't confined to the rarefied pages of scientific journals. It occasionally spilled over into the popular press, as both men sought to cultivate public image and garner support. They understood the public's fascination with these giant prehistoric creatures, and newspaper articles heralding spectacular new discoveries were a way to build their reputations and perhaps attract further funding or political backing. Historians still debate the extent to which Marsh and Cope actively manipulated the press to discredit each other during the height of their field operations, or whether the more scandalous public accusations came later as their animosity reached its peak. However, even in this period, you can sense them using their publications not just for scientific communication, but as weapons in their ongoing war. Each new dinosaur named, Each impressive skeleton mounted, or promised for future mounting, was a point scored, a territory claimed in the battle for paleontological supremacy. The quiet, collaborative ideal of science was often lost in the dust kicked up by their colossal ambitions and equally colossal egos. As the 1880s dawned, the Bone Wars had been raging for over a decade, a relentless paleontological arms race that had transformed the American West into a vast hunting ground for prehistoric giants. You can imagine the sheer tonnage of fossilized bones that had been excavated, crated, and shipped east to the storerooms of Yale's Peabody Museum and Cope's overburdened Philadelphia collections. We're talking about hundreds of tons of material, representing hundreds of new species, or at least hundreds of newly named species, given their penchant for rapid publication. The scientific world and the public were agog at the incredible bestiary emerging from the American frontier, monstrous sauropods with necks long enough to peer into third-story windows, armored stegosaurs with their bizarre plates, and fearsome predators with teeth like daggers. The drive to discover and name was all-consuming. For both Marsh and Cope, it wasn't just about the fossils themselves. It was about establishing their own legacy, about dominating the narrative of American paleontology. You can feel the almost manic energy, particularly in Cope, who, facing dwindling personal finances, redoubled his efforts, sometimes working himself to the point of exhaustion, desperate to keep pace with the better-funded Marsh. Marsh, for his part, used his institutional power and government connections to consolidate his position, sometimes claiming vast swathes of fossil territory as effectively his own, much to Cope's fury. A mainstream historical fact is that the sheer number of new genera and species described by Marsh and Cope during this period, Marsh named some 80 new dinosaurs, Cope around 56, was unprecedented and in some ways overwhelming for the young science of paleontology. However, this rapid-fire approach came at a scientific cost. In their haste to publish and claim priority, mistakes were inevitably made. Skeletons were sometimes reconstructed incorrectly, as with Marsh's infamous Brontosaurus skull or Cope's initial Elasmosaurus blunder. Species were named based on very fragmentary material, leading to what paleontologists call nomina dubia, doubtful names that can't be reliably assigned to any particular animal. Furthermore, both men were notorious splitters, meaning they often gave new names to specimens that differed only slightly from already known species, or that represented different growth stages or sexes of the same animal. This taxonomic oversplitting created a confusing morass of names that would take later generations of paleontologists decades to sort out. One quirky detail is the sheer vindictiveness that sometimes crept into their scientific descriptions. It wasn't unheard of for one to name a particularly unimpressive or dubious fossil after a perceived flaw or associate of their rival, a subtle academic insult hidden in Latin nomenclature. Ah, Morosaurus' stupid lizard by Marsh. I wonder who that was aimed at. The financial and personal toll was also mounting. Cope, as you know, poured his inheritance into the Bone Wars, and by the 1880s, he was facing serious financial difficulties. He even resorted to leasing out parts of his fossil collection to try and raise funds. Marsh, while more secure financially due to his Yale position and government support, was also investing heavily in his collections and expeditions. Historians still debate the extent to which the Bone Wars became a financially unsustainable obsession for both men, particularly Cope. Was the pursuit of paleontological glory blinding them to the long-term costs, both fiscal and reputational? Moreover, the richest and most easily accessible fossil deposits, like those at Como Bluff, were beginning to be exhausted by the late 1880s. The pace of spectacular new discoveries started to slow, though important finds continued to be made. You can sense a growing weariness, perhaps, even amidst the ongoing animosity. The heroic age of discovery, that initial exhilarating rush of unearthing one monster after another, was giving way to the more painstaking work of preparing, studying, and trying to make sense of the mountains of bones already collected. The war had yielded an incredible bounty, but it had also left a trail of scientific confusion, financial strain, and deeply entrenched personal bitterness. The public, while still fascinated by dinosaurs, was perhaps also beginning to hear whispers of the unseemly squabbles behind the impressive museum displays. The stage was being set for the final, and perhaps most damaging phase of their feud, one that would spill out from the fossil fields and academic journals onto the front pages of newspapers. Okay, here is the first part of Act 3. Act 3. The bitter personal rivalry between O.C. Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, which had fueled the Bone Wars across the fossil fields of the American West for so long, was about to spill out from the dusty plains and academic journals into a far more public and damaging arena, the pages of a major American newspaper. You can imagine the years of simmering resentment, the accusations whispered in private or hinted at in scientific papers, finally reaching a boiling point. The late 1880s and early 1890s see the feud escalate from a battle for bones to a war of words, a public relations disaster that would tarnish both their legacies, even as it cemented their legend as science's most infamous rivals. The catalyst for this public explosion was largely Cope, financially struggling, feeling overshadowed by Marsh's institutional power and his secure position with the U.S. Geological Survey, and perhaps genuinely believing Marsh was misusing government funds or engaging in scientific misconduct. Cope decided to take his grievances public. You can picture him, a man of fierce intellect and equally fierce passions, perhaps feeling he had nothing left to lose, making contact with a journalist from the New York Herald. He unloads years of pent-up accusations against Marsh, charges of plagiarism, of scientific incompetence, of errors in his publications, and, most damagingly, of mismanaging government funds and using his USGS position to his own advantage and to the detriment of other scientists, namely Cope himself. A mainstream historical fact is that in January 1890, the New York Herald published a sensational front-page story, headlined with something along the lines of "Scientists Wage Bitter Warfare," detailing Cope's explosive allegations against Marsh. It was the scientific equivalent of a celebrity tell-all, and the public, always eager for a good scandal, lapped it up. Marsh, of course, was not one to take such an attack lying down. You can imagine his fury upon reading the Herald. He was a man who valued his reputation and his position immensely. He quickly retaliated, providing the newspaper with his own list of counter-accusations against Cope, highlighting Cope's own scientific errors. That old Elasmosaurus blunder likely got another airing. His financial recklessness and questioning his scientific integrity. The Herald gleefully published these rejoinders, and for a few weeks, the public was treated to a rather unedifying spectacle of two of America's leading scientists slinging mud at each other in print. It was a far cry from the noble pursuit of knowledge. It's like watching two esteemed professors get into a pie fight at a fancy academic conference. Entertaining for the onlookers, perhaps, but not great for the dignity of the profession. Breaking news. Doctor. Fossil finder calls doctor. Bone digger. A Cretaceous Cretan, and questions his understanding of basic Triceratops anatomy. More at 11. The fallout from this public feud was significant. While it might have provided some sensational reading for the newspaper-buying public, it did serious damage to the reputations of both men within the scientific community and in the eyes of the government. One quirky detail is that some of their colleagues, who had long been aware of the rivalry, but perhaps hoped it would remain a more private, if intense, academic squabble, were dismayed by this public airing of dirty laundry. It reflected poorly on American science as a whole. More consequentially, the accusations of financial mismanagement and misuse of government resources, particularly those leveled against Marsh due to his USGS affiliation, led to congressional investigations. Historians still debate the ultimate fairness or accuracy of all the charges and countercharges. Was Marsh truly corrupt, or was Cope, in his desperation, exaggerating or misrepresenting facts? Was Cope the reckless spendthrift and sloppy scientist Marsh painted him to be, or was he a brilliant, if sometimes disorganized, pioneer, unfairly targeted by a more powerful rival? The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in the messy middle. What is clear is that the scandal had consequences. Marsh's government funding and his position with the USGS came under scrutiny and were eventually reduced. Cope, while perhaps feeling some vindication at having exposed his rival, did not emerge unscathed either. His own reputation for impulsiveness and personal attacks was reinforced. You can feel the bitter irony. Their all-consuming quest for scientific glory and personal dominance had led them to a point where they were actively trying to destroy each other's careers. A sad and rather tawdry chapter in the history of American science. The Bone Wars had moved from the field to the front page, and the casualties were their own reputations. The public mudslinging match in the New York Herald certainly cast a long, unflattering shadow over O.C. Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, and it undoubtedly took a toll on their standing and resources. Yet as the dust from that particular scandal began to settle, it's impossible to ignore the monumental scientific legacy that emerged from their decades of ferocious competition. You can almost see two sides to the Bone Wars coin. On one, the petty jealousies and destructive tactics, but on the other, an unprecedented explosion of paleontological discovery that forever changed our understanding of prehistoric life on Earth. Despite the personal acrimony, their relentless drive unearthed a lost world of astonishing creatures. The sheer volume of fossils collected by Marsh and Cope and their teams is staggering. We're talking about literally hundreds of tons of bones, representing thousands of individual specimens. These weren't just isolated fragments. They included many nearly complete skeletons of dinosaurs and other extinct animals, many of them entirely new to science. A mainstream historical fact is that the collections amassed by Marsh for Yale's Peabody Museum and by Cope, which eventually found a home at the American Museum of Natural History in New York after his death, became and remain some of the most important paleontological collections in the world. These vast archives of bone became the raw material for generations of subsequent research. You can imagine those museum basements, then and now, filled with rows upon rows of carefully cataloged fossils, a testament to the sheer scale of their ambition and the richness of the American West. And what a bestiary it was. Despite the taxonomic tangles caused by their hasty naming practices, Marsh and Cope were responsible for introducing the world to a menagerie of iconic dinosaurs. Marsh's discoveries, as you know, included giants like Apatosaurus, the dinosaur formerly known as Brontosaurus for many, Diplodocus, and Stegosaurus, as well as the formidable Allosaurus and the horned Triceratops. Cope, for his part, described spectacular creatures like Camarasaurus, Monoclonius. Though its validity is debated, it was an early ceratopsian find, and many important fossil mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. Their work essentially laid the foundation for our modern understanding of the age of dinosaurs, particularly the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods in North America. It's like they were filling in vast, empty galleries in the Museum of Life, populating them with creatures more wondrous and bizarre than anyone had previously imagined. Oh, you thought history was just kings and queens? Hold my pickaxe. I'm about to show you a 70-ton lizard with a neck longer than your house. Beyond just discovering new species, their work also spurred advancements in paleontological methods. The challenges of excavating, transporting, and preparing these massive and often fragile fossils led to innovations in fieldwork and museum techniques. The use of plaster jacketing to protect bones during removal, for example, became standard practice. The sheer volume of material also forced a more systematic approach to classification and comparative anatomy, even if their own taxonomic practices were sometimes chaotic. One quirky detail is that the public's fascination with these dragons of the ancient past, fueled by the spectacular discoveries of Marsh and Cope, helped to popularize paleontology and create public support for museums and scientific research. The Bone Wars, for all their ugliness, inadvertently made dinosaurs incredibly cool. Historians still debate whether the same pace of discovery would have occurred without the intense rivalry. Did their competition, as destructive as it sometimes was, ultimately accelerate the exploration of the American West and the unearthing of its fossil treasures? Or would a more collaborative, careful approach have yielded equally significant, perhaps even better preserved, results in the long run without the scientific confusion caused by their hasty publications and personal animosities? It's a difficult counterfactual to prove. What remains undeniable is that these two driven, flawed, and brilliant men, locked in their epic feud, fundamentally transformed American paleontology from a niche pursuit into a major scientific endeavor, revealing a lost world of unparalleled grandeur and leaving behind a legacy of bones that continues to fascinate and educate us to this day. You can feel the immense weight of their combined contribution, a mountain of fossils that provides a bedrock for our understanding of deep time. The public airing of their grievances in the New York Herald and the subsequent government scrutiny marked a turning point, a rather sour and exhausting chapter in the long saga of the Bone Wars. For both O.C. Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, the final years of the 19th century were a period of waning influence, financial strain, especially for Cope, and perhaps a growing awareness of the personal and professional cost of their epic feud. You can imagine these two brilliant, aging titans, once the undisputed kings of American paleontology, now somewhat diminished, their energies sapped by decades of relentless competition and public battles. Cope, who had poured his personal fortune into his fossil collecting and research, and had suffered from some disastrous mining investments, died in 1897 in relatively modest circumstances in Philadelphia. He was only 56. He continued to work and publish almost until the very end, a testament to his indomitable intellectual energy. A mainstream historical fact, and a rather poignant one, is that Cope willed his body to science, hoping that his brain would be studied and perhaps found to be larger than that of his rival, Marsh, a final, rather macabre act of competition. Though it's said his brain was indeed examined and found to be of normal size, a direct comparison with Marsh's never took place in that manner. His vast and incredibly important fossil collection, as you know, was eventually purchased by the American Museum of Natural History, securing its preservation for future generations. Marsh lived a couple of years longer, dying in 1899 at the age of 67. He remained at Yale, and while his government funding had been curtailed after the scandal, he left his extensive collections and a significant portion of his estate, derived largely from his uncle George Peabody, to the Peabody Museum. His legacy as the builder of one of America's great natural history museums was secure, but his reputation, like Cope's, had been undeniably tarnished by the bitterness and ruthlessness of their rivalry. You can picture him in his later years, perhaps surrounded by the monumental skeletons he had brought to light. A figure of immense scientific achievement, but also a reminder of the sometimes destructive power of ambition. So, how are the Bone Wars remembered today? It's a complex legacy, a mixture of astonishing scientific advancement and regrettable personal conduct. On one hand, it was a golden age of dinosaur discovery in North America. The sheer number of new species unearthed and described by Marsh, Cope, and their teams was staggering, laying the groundwork for much of 20th century paleontology. They brought dinosaurs into the public consciousness in an unprecedented way, fueling a fascination that continues to this day. One quirky detail often cited is how many of the dinosaurs that are household names, Triceratops, Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, Diplodocus, were products of the Bone Wars. Without their frantic, competitive digging, our knowledge of the Mesozoic era would be significantly poorer. It's like they single-handedly, or perhaps two-handedly, in bitter opposition, wrote the first great encyclopedia of dinosaurs. Sure, they tried to ruin each other, but look at all these cool fossils. Worth it? Maybe? However, the Bone Wars also stand as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition, personal animosity, and unethical behavior in science. The rushed publications, the taxonomic chaos, the secretive and sometimes destructive field practices, and the public mudslinging did lasting damage. Historians still debate whether the benefits of the rapid discoveries outweighed the costs of the scientific confusion and the ethical lapses. Could the same, or even greater, scientific progress have been achieved through collaboration and more careful, systematic work? It's a question that hangs over their story. Ultimately, the Bone Wars are a uniquely American saga, born out of the Gilded Age's spirit of aggressive expansion and fierce individualism, played out against the backdrop of the Wild West. Marsh and Cope were complex figures, brilliant scientists driven by an almost pathological need to outdo one another. Their feud, while often unseemly, undeniably propelled American paleontology onto the world stage. You are left with the image of these two men, forever locked in their epic struggle, surrounded by the bones of ancient giants, a dramatic, if somewhat troubling, chapter in the history of science. Their slow, often contentious chisels, both literal and intellectual, unlocked a world, even as they chipped away at each other. Now, as our exploration of the Bone Wars and the fierce rivalry of Marsh and Cope concludes, let the images of dusty dig sites, colossal skeletons, and battling paleontologists gently fade from your mind. Their story of ambition, discovery, and bitter conflict can now become a distant echo, a quiet historical anecdote as you prepare for your own peaceful rest. Allow the thought of those ancient bones, once objects of intense competition, to transform into symbols of deep, undisturbed slumber. The harsh conditions of the western fossil fields can be replaced by the comfort and tranquility of your own surroundings. The clatter of pickaxes and the whispers of secretive field agents can fade away, leaving only the gentle stillness of your room. Any lingering thoughts about their epic feud, their scientific triumphs, or their personal failings can now dissolve, unimportant for this moment of peace. There are no more fossils to excavate, no more academic battles to fight. There is only the gentle descent into sleep. The giants of the Mesozoic, unearthed with such passion, now stand silent in museum halls, and you too can find a similar stillness, a profound and restorative calm. Good night.